Thanks for choosing to listen into the Zelos Podcast, the show that's all about the pros behind the pros in sports. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder. This week, AJ Patrick is my guest. He's in charge of performance and acquisition for the Pittsburgh Pirates. But before we get underway, check out my website, rockysnyder.com, podcast archives, blogs, there's continuing education online courses, as well as a calendar for in-person courses, such as September 27th this year at the Perform Better Functional Training Institute. I will be leading a one-day workshop. The title is Recalibrating Movement from the Ground Up. If you happen to be at the Providence Perform Better Summit, this is going to be basically that and then some. I was able to give an hour or two while we're at the summit, but this is all day exposure to closed chain biomechanics, how the human body actually works, and how that carries over into rehab and the weight room. You'll be looking at movement like you've never seen it before. Be sure to grab a copy of my book, Return to Center. It's strength training to realign the body, recover from pain, and achieve optimal performance. You can get it through my website or Amazon or wherever. Check out Satanta College. They have Masters of Science programs and different tracks, like the one I just completed in sports injury and return to performance. Put in RS10 for 10% off tuition. Follow us on Instagram at Rocky_Snyder. Click the subscribe button. Enjoy the show. Man, AJ, you've been on my radar for a couple of months now, and I'm really glad we got this time to schedule to get together to talk, because your story is quite unique, and I really want to dive in. But before that, how about giving the listening audience a little bit of an understanding of who AJ Patrick is and what got you to the place that you're in right now? Give us your origin, if you don't mind.
Sure. No, I appreciate you having me on. Been looking forward to catching up with you. Yeah, origin story. I'll try to be as quick as I can with it, I guess.
We got time. We got time.
Yeah, right. Yeah, born and raised in Florida, North Florida. Always into sports, from a young age. So I've always been tied to it, especially baseball. It was kind of like the only sport that was available formally where I would grow up. Kind of grew up in a small town. Played all the way up through college, and I was unfortunately the guy in college who always ended up being hurt every year. I think that likely had some type of link towards understanding the body a little bit more. Always enjoyed exercise and fitness and things like that, but going through that process of constantly having some nagging injuries that I felt impacted my performance. Probably led me more along the lines of looking into physical therapy or something along those lines. I initially went into school looking at athletic training, just because the superficial look of medical compared to applied to sports. But then I learned a little bit more about what is brought to the table within physical therapy, and I had just felt it was a little bit better fit for me. So went to school, finished with my doctorate in 2010 for physical therapy, and started like a mini therapist, more of your conventional, insurance-based clinics like a lot do, and getting reps of working with higher caseloads and meeting a lot of people. I kind of had the mentality I just wanted to work with anybody who walked through the door, right? Just build a broad spectrum of treatment and ability to impact people. So did that for a few years, and then I started just getting the itch to want to be more specialized. I missed the team environment, the idea of a lot of people working towards a common goal. So just started looking around a little bit more of some different opportunities in that regard. And, fortunately, an opportunity working with Army Special Operations presented itself, where they were, preparing and developing a program called Thor 3 that was unique in that it was developing performance teams for different groups of special operations. So I had the opportunity to go work at Fort Bragg, which is Fort Liberty now, they switched the name. But I was able to work there for about a year in 2014, which was a great opportunity for me because it was my first time.
How did that happen? How did you get that role?
Yeah, well, I knew somebody who was already in the program early. They were one of the first PTs that kind of was established within one of the special forces groups, and he learned that they were opening more groups, and put my name out there to some of the leadership that I could be a good fit, and went through the process, the interviews, all those types of things, and luckily for me, it just worked out. And it was a unique opportunity. It was my first time as a clinician being able to work with other subject matter experts on a day-to-day basis, strength coaches, nutritionists, mental performance coaches, all within the same area on a day-to-day basis. And that was a very eye-opening experience for me, because as a more conventional physical therapist in the clinic, you're kind of just working your own caseload. Maybe you occasionally can have a conversation with another clinician at the end of the day when you're done, but you're kind of isolated in your own world in a way. Whereas in this more performance setting, you're bouncing ideas off of different professionals that have different perspective and lenses on each person that you work with. So I was able to learn a lot from that.
So
Unfortunately,
if I
the
could,
yeah, sure.
I'm going to interrupt you because
Oh, go
you
ahead.
got
Yeah, I'll
so
keep going.
much there.
Yeah.
So when you're in that setting, going from individualized specialist or Gen Pop PT, and now you're going into special forces, team oriented. The dynamics obviously completely different. What were the big things that you were taking from that kind of team, and not necessarily only from the strength coach or mental skills? Like what were you absorbing?
I think the biggest takeaway, especially early on, was that the idea of a patient or client's plan is bigger than just what you bring to the table. There's a lot of other perspectives that you have to consider, both, what are their ultimate goals from a performance standpoint? What are all the different areas that could be impacted or influenced within that plan? As a isolated clinician, all you can really focus on what you can control. And you don't really have the ability to impact some of those other areas because they're done away from you. And you don't really, outside of having some conversations over the phone, you don't really have much of an impact there. Whereas in this setting, you're you're speaking and going through dialogue on everybody's plan, and picking it apart constructively and giving feedback and perspective, and seeing how what maybe another clinician or strength coach is doing, how could that potentially impact what I'm doing and how I'm spending my time with the client or the patient. So I think that was a big piece for me, learning curve of learning how to kind of work in synergy with other teammates on one collective plan of keeping that patient or that client in the center and them being involved in that process. And also the ability to really see the long-term performance objective and work backwards from there to build a plan. That was really my first exposure of really being able to do that, because yeah, in your typical clinic setting, you're not really seeing it all the way through, right? Like as soon as they're relatively close to being out of pain, they're gone, they're
Yeah,
discharged, right? And that's
you get to that modicum. You get to
right.
that point where you're like, okay, this is the acceptable minimal allowance that we've reached, and now you can go off on your own. So
Correct.
I totally get that. Okay, here's my question then: is that with your educational background and experiential knowledge by working with general population, there's probably tools or concepts that you weren't needing in that population, but you were keeping it in your back pocket, so to speak, mentally. And now you're with a higher level and a completely different needs analysis and demand. Were there things in your past educational path or experience that you were like, oh, this is where this comes in now? I can actually use this when before it wasn't necessary because I just had to bring them up to the minimal acceptable range.
Sure. I think where it really comes into play, and something that's harped on a lot, you know, everybody in school gets a certain fundamental understanding of a lot of topics. That's kind of how school is, right? But
Sure.
one big thing that was pushed with us as physical therapists coming out was being experts in movement analysis and understanding movement. And I think that early on in the career, when you are capped by that conventional setup in the clinic, is short of very isolated movements, maybe you're lucky and you can do some squat analysis or something like that. You're not really seeing true performance based movement patterns that somebody may be doing, whether it's in sport or within their job, um, because you're just not really getting as much access to that. Because by the time that they can really do those more advanced movements and you can really see it, not just the movement, but the movement with an expression of force, they're gone. You're not able to see that. So I think tapping into not only the knowledge, but the curiosity around movement and movement analysis at a high level was something I was able to really start engaging in once I got into the setting, that I was able to see and work with the patient past the point of the more basic localized treatment that I may be doing with them, and moving them to that next step of like, all right, how do we transfer this not only to the weight room, but to the performance and the job requirements that you have out in the field?
I love that. Okay. Speaking of next step, you take that insight You take that background in movement analysis, and now you go from special forces to professional baseball, which is got to be one of the sports. I mean, golf might be above baseball in terms of analytics of movement and the analysis of the minutia of every single thing, from gripping on the bat to finger placement on a ball to stride length. I mean, you can geek out till the cows come home.
Right.
That must have been just almost like a natural transition in that regard, was it?
Sure. I think that the experience with the military definitely prepared me uh, going into pro sports because I had at least a taste and an idea of what it felt like to work in a performance team setting. The transition from straight from the clinic into professional sports can take some time. And, even in my roles with the Pirates, I've hired physical therapists out of the clinic and it takes some time to adjust in that. So I was fortunate to have at least a year of almost a bridge of working with other subject matter experts, learning how to lean on them, and be in more of that setting that it's more of the training room setting, right? Where it's not like every hour this person's coming in at this time and this time. Like it's a little bit more, chaotic than that. Um, and you're planning more of the full day. It's not like you're just working with that 1 hour of treatment or program. You're planning 4, 5, 6 hours of their day, especially those who are actually on rehab, because you're kind of quarterbacking the whole process. And that takes some getting used to, but also is it's a challenge, but it's really fun because you have the ability to implement and have your kind of fingerprint on a lot of aspects of the program, and it makes you step back and see the bigger picture of like, oh, what are we ultimately trying to get to with this athlete? Not just rehabbing their injury, but the goal of either them exceeding or being at or exceeding the performance levels they were when they returned back to sport.
Right on. Okay, movement analysis, understanding that visual or observational information is key, using your
Right.
eyes and seeing what you see. But if we could put that on the shelf for a moment, when you were working with the special forces and making your way to MLB, were there certain tools, devices, software that you were utilizing for movement analysis that you found with the Pirates as well? Or was it a learning curve in terms of, okay, this is how we're analyzing here, and we need you to be up to speed on this, even if it only took a week or a month or whatever?
Yeah, I would say there's a little bit more access to objective measurement resources once I got into professional baseball than what we had with the military. Now, at that time, again, I was part of a pretty new group where we were still in the process of building out the facility, right? So we took on, soldiers to work with because there was such a need to get people better, but we were still in the process of getting all of our equipment and all the, measurement tools and all those things before the program was put on freeze. So really the only access from objective data that we really had at that point were, force plates that we would use to get some objective data. A lot of it from there was really more of trying to get a better understanding of what their requirements and their expectations in the field were, and then build backwards from there from a programming standpoint. So me and the strength coach a lot of times would go out in the field and watch what they would be doing, whether they're doing, airborne jumps and landing, which is where a lot of injuries would come from, poor landings and hurting their lower half, or, something they're doing on the range, trying to get a better feel for what those guys were doing. And to be honest, one of the challenging pieces in that setting, just because of the population we were working with, sometimes you weren't really allowed to know what they were training for, or maybe they didn't know what they were training for until they got there and they were deployed. So sometimes you were working off of limited information in regards to what you were planning them and preparing them for. But the cycles of the programming was very similar. You take a soldier getting ready for deployment. It's like an athlete getting ready for season, right? So you're still building them up through their equivalent off season competition season, getting them ready to be deployed. So it's a very similar structure to the cycles of the programming that you were looking for. So that was an easy kind of roll into once you got into pro sports, because the sequencing of the programming was it was a pretty seamless process of that crossover.
I could see that because we're talking about the career. We're talking about careers, really. Whether you're a career soldier or a career athlete, the design of the program is going to be uh, highly compliant, highly comprehensive, and it's all about performance for both kind of circles. So I definitely see how that carryover would be. So now we're going to fast forward to like 2015, 2016. You are now, instead of, we'll say PFC, not for private first class, but the Pirates Florida complex. You're in
Right.
Florida. You're in the complex and you enter as a minor league physical therapist. And just for the listening audience, then you go to rehab coordinator after that, senior coordinator of rehab and athlete development. Then you move into the director of sports performance. And these days, the special assistants to performance and acquisition. Now, before we get to that last title, like, give me a sense of what that progression through the Pirates organization was like. Is that kind of a natural progression if, say, a lot of the listening audience is young, aspiring physical therapists? Is that a common path that you take?
I would probably say not totally. I wouldn't say it's a very common path. I think I kind of took a chance in my career of you know, walking the slippery slope of doing something a little different. I think most physical therapists getting into any sport, and just kind of take baseball for example, your ultimate goal is to become a major league physical therapist and be on the team and traveling with the team. Um, Not that that didn't intrigue me to a certain level. I just felt like I had curiosity in some other areas, more along the lines of developing systems and processes, and more of an overarching theme of how do I collectively impact a larger group versus just a team. And that was kind of something that I just had in mind, even from day one when I got into professional baseball. So early on, it was a lot of your traditional carrying a caseload, right? I was responsible for all of the longer term rehabs through the minor league system, and then the major league long-term rehabs would come down to see me at our facility in Florida. Moving into the coordinator roles, I started having a little bit more responsibility and general oversight of programming. Whether it was assisting the athletic trainers when there were smaller injuries at the teams in season, starting the integration of strength conditioning not only within the rehab process, but how are we doing it with our healthy players from both a preventative standpoint, but also a improvement in performance standpoint, and having those conversations with the skill baseball coaches of how can we look to influence from a strength conditioning standpoint and help expedite the process of some of the things you're working on from a pure skill movement standpoint on the field. And that was really the trajectory of a lot of the work that I did. I mean, different titles were assigned at different times, but in general, that was kind of the natural flow of where my responsibilities were, at least through that senior coordinator position there, where a lot of at that time was taking the vision and direction of our directors at the time and trying to figure out, all right, I understand, what the vision is in strength conditioning, what the vision is in medical, what the vision is in nutrition. Now, how can I help create a system and a process that brings all of those thoughts together for one collective united front from a programming and communication standpoint? So once I got to that senior coordinator level, that was a lot of what I was doing at that time, was trying to puzzle piece those things together, all while still working with some patients at time. At that time, I wasn't, I still had a smaller caseload for more complex cases, but I was spending a little bit more time in staff development and overall programming once I got there.
Yeah, no, I that sounds fantastic. Using that analogy of puzzle pieces, I'm just envisioning from my own personal background or professional background is that as I stay in the strength conditioning environment, the fitness environment, personal training and whatnot, performance, I see over time the missing puzzle pieces, or not the piece itself, but the space that it has not been filled in. So gaps, if you will. And so I'm thinking that as you're working in the complex, in the daily environment, and seeing the systems in place, what was apparent to you, without putting anybody's neck on the chopping block in any way
Sure.
whatsoever, but where were the gaps? What were the pieces that needed to be put together? Albeit you already spoke about the cohesiveness and intercommunication amongst the different departments and disciplines, but were there other things that just stood out, being like, oh, we've got we've got the athletic trainer and the physical therapist that have the experience here, and then we've got the strength coach. And although it should be a Venn diagram, we don't really have a rehab strength conditioning coach. So there's that, or maybe we need a sleep specialist because of the travel, like, or maybe it's something completely else that I'm not thinking about. What were the pieces that needed to be filled in your mind?
Yeah, I think you've hit on them, and I think a lot of larger, teams or larger businesses that have multiple departments and areas probably fall victim to it at times, and we did as well. It's easy for everywhere, although with a lot of you know positive influence and wanting to help because everybody in those settings are trying to help, but it's very easy to end up working in isolation, and kind of staying in your silo, if you will. And that
Yeah.
negatively impacts communication, and also just the collective plan of the player. And I think that was where we spent the most time, was the idea that we don't have a strength conditioning plan, we don't have a skill development plan, we don't have a rehab plan, we have a single plan that everybody contributes to. And depending on the timing of where the athlete is in their development, there may be varying levels of percentages of where you weight into that process. So, like for example, if it was a pretty early rehab plan, and obviously there's going to be a lot of heavy influence and work with the rehab specialist, they may be more of the person spending the most time in there. But the other piece of it is, how can strength conditioning help support and facilitate what the physical therapist is doing? How can the skill development coach help influence what the physical therapist is doing? And eventually they move past to the point where they're more advanced, they're starting to do things in the field. Now it may be more strength conditioning and skill development that's working. So that doesn't mean the physical therapist is done at that point. Now they shift into the role of, how do I help influence and facilitate what the skill development coach is doing and what the strength conditioning coach is doing? So everybody has a consistent piece of the puzzle that's going on all the time, but you shift back and forth depending on where the priority is for the athlete at that given time. And I think that's a struggle a lot of times for a lot of people, because everybody's so intentional about wanting to help. Everybody feels like their area is the most important all the time, and you end up banging heads, because you don't have enough time, and the player is confused of really, where should I be spending my time. And it's just a very inefficient plan when you take that approach. So that was a lot of where we spent a ton of time, was how do we structure a plan, and who can kind of provide some oversight of determining what's the most important thing for this athlete at this given time. What are the goals and objectives we're trying to meet? How can everybody within the performance team help influence towards those goals? And then once we hit a new milestone and move to the next piece, how does the hierarchy of time and shift based off where the plan is? And then everybody kind of reevaluates their role within that plan.
So I love that answer, by the way. That is fantastic because it gets me thinking. There's really any answer that gets me thinking, I think, is really beneficial. So what I hear you saying is that you need individualized triage to get a needs analysis of each of your athletes, and almost create, in my head right now, is a pie chart where you have all your disciplines, all the different stakeholders that are on this pie chart. Some are going to have a really thin wafer of a wedge at this moment in time, where there's going to be a big piece of pie for something else. So if this is post surgery, or let's just say going into surgery, then your sports medicine, your AT and PT are going to have the big wedges, and potentially there'll be a smaller wedge for the strength conditioning. But I see a medium-sized wedge for mental skills, and so is that kind of how you lay it out, or how do you how do you create a visual information from one player to the next, if in fact you do, like, or is it just something that you pull up the person's file and here it is listed in words? Like, how do you get that point across for all your stakeholders?
Sure. I mean, it takes a lot of time and effort, obviously, but I think
Yeah.
the advantage of being in the professional setting is you're with those people every day, right? So typically there's daily meetings on all of the players, on, what are the goals and the expectations for the player for the day or for the week, and then, what does the programming from each area look like that's going to impact the player. And then a lot of times there's post day meetings where you're going back over, how did the day go? Where do we need to make adjustments? How can we make, either adjustments to the programming or scheduling conflicts that we have to work around? So everybody's involved and engaged in the conversation. And I like your pie chart analogy of the idea of there being wedges. And I think that paints the proper picture of kind of what I was trying to get to, in that there's always a wedge for each person. And I think that's the trap a lot of times that is easy to fall into when you're working more in the silos. And that, if it's early on in the rehab care, like, okay, well, for the next 6 weeks, there's no wedge for strength conditioning. Once they get here, then hand them off to strength conditioning. No, like from week one, there's still a wedge for strength conditioning, because we have to focus on what the athlete can do, not what they can't do. So if you're keeping the mindset of always trying to find ways to positively impact the athlete and focusing on what they can do, there's always going to be work for each area to work on. So that was always the mindset of, even if you can't do a lot because of the injury or the circumstance, what can you do for the athlete? How can you move the player to the next dot in regards to their plan, and then present that to the group so there's transparency of what you're working on. And I feel like that system really moved us forward in regards to our communication, our connection to the player, our trust that the player had in the plan, and also the connection to skill development on the field, which is a very hot topic always from a rehab and strength and conditioning standpoint, is the idea of transfer, right? Like, how are we assessing if what we're doing from the weight room is transferring onto the field? One of the easiest ways to do that is to make sure you're really in line with a skill development coach and understanding what they're doing and trying to accomplish on the field, what types of drills they're doing on the field, and then find ways, through your own analysis from a pure physical quality standpoint, of how you could potentially supplement what they're doing while they're working with the player.
Yeah, yeah, well said. I just think that every movement, every exercise can either draw us into a more balanced state where performance at its optimal level, or it can do just the opposite and draw us off of balance and create, well, in terms of biomechanics, compensatory actions that create greater stress on the body repetitively over time. Because I mean, baseball is repetition, and we're looking at pitch counts, we're looking at how many swings, we're looking at the repetition of these stressors on the body. And so for me professionally, I guess, and personally, is that I look at every exercise that it's either corrective, meaning it's drawing us into a more balanced place, or it's not corrective, and it might be needed, but at the same time, is it really transferring? And not to get on the soapbox, but most of the gym exercises that are in the weight room are not baseball oriented. They're not baseball specific. We've borrowed them from powerlifting and Olympic lifting and bodybuilding, and we're trying to fit that round peg into the square hole of baseball. So, I think there's many people that just kind of rationalize it till the cows come home and realize that, okay, well, maybe bench press is going to actually reduce shoulder range of motion, but damn it, I don't want to let go of it. Like, there's something to be said about people just holding on to old ideas and taking that leap of faith that, you know what, we might actually have to look at how these are truly transferring over. I don't know, I'm going off on a rant right now, but I think you're in the same kind of the same field with me when it comes to that.
Sure. No, I mean, I would agree. Like, every exercise can be great or terrible depending on how you use it, right? And I think where a lot of times, it's easy to fall into traps, either as a clinician or a strength coach, is not really having that ultimate goal of performance in mind and working backwards from there. Because if you don't really have a good understanding of the movements that you're trying to impact, it's really challenging to prescribe the appropriate exercises to get there. So then you fall back on your defaults of what you potentially like to do, or what you've done with
Exactly.
guys in the past, but it may not be individualized for the athlete that's in front of you. And I think at least the way I look at it, is you have to look at exercises, you know, similar as prescribing medication, like, which is what we're doing. At the end of the day, we're influencing
Exactly.
movement, where we're trying to provide and open up new movement solutions on the field. Ultimately, is what we're doing. And you're not prescribing an exercise; you're prescribing force, because the cells of the body respond to force. So, are you choosing the appropriate movement within the exercise and the appropriate parameters around the resistance to prescribe the particular force that you're trying to implement to facilitate changes in tissue? And are you doing that in a way that moves them closer to the field? And if you're not looking at it that way, you run into potential gaps in your programming not understanding why, when I choose this, it's not getting the result I want.
Dude, that is brilliant. Honestly, like I am smiling ear to ear right now with the prescription of force, not exercise prescription. I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that in that regard. And it is just spot on. And there's going to be angulations that are overwhelming that don't need to be reinforced, but there's going to be the ones that are hiding in the shadow that no one's looking at that you have to pick out and be like, you know what? We need to create force at this vector or in this manner. Or I love that thought there. Okay,
And it doesn't
go
have to
ahead.
be high levels, right? Like I
No,
don't want to mistake, because I mean, me putting my hands on somebody and doing a joint mobilization is an expression of force, right? So it's not
well
about a
said.
high effort, low efforts necessarily. It's about what types of physical qualities are you trying to implement and how are you trying to influence the tissue. And then just understanding that you're looking at it in that way. It's not as much about, the movement. The movement's kind of like the capsule, but the force is the medication inside the capsule. So you just have to make sure that you're actually prescribing that in the appropriate manner.
Yeah, and I think we actually tried to use often resistance against the body, external resistance, and it is very overwhelming. No matter how high level caliber the athlete is, there's weak links in the chain, and it may be that we actually have to reduce some of their body weight or assist them in a way that'll actually create the force that we're looking to generate in the body for the optimal response. Okay.
Right.
uh, Oh my God, this is such a great conversation. I knew it would be. So here's the thing: is as far as I know, the state of Maine is the only state in all 50 that do not require physical therapists to maintain continuing education to keep their license.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah, I don't
I didn't
ask
know
me
that.
why I'm not. Yep, that's the
Yeah.
only one as far as I know. But Floridian PTs, and for this matter, you're in Colorado right now, so Coloradan PTs have to
Right.
maintain it. So over the course of these years, say for the last 9 to 10 years, where do you get your continuing education? You say movement analysis, or are there some really cool things that I should be checking out?
Yeah, I mean, I really try to prescribe to learning a lot about everything, right? Like I don't feel like I'm, married to one philosophy. I feel like with every athlete or every person that comes to the door, everybody's different. So if we're asking the athlete or the client to have a lot of different movement solutions to, perform in life, then we need to have a lot of treatment solutions, because everybody's different. You have to have a lot of different ways of doing things. That doesn't mean that you don't have core principles that you kind of abide by based off your skills and your experience, but you have to have a lot of variety, right? So, I mean, I feel like I've spent early on, like I was very infatuated with manual therapy, doing a lot of manually based treatment from a pure clinician standpoint. So, a lot of my continuing education, purely from a um, clinician standpoint, has probably been within manual therapy, whether it's joint mobilizations, soft tissue mobilizations, manipulations, dry needling, those types of things. Of finding ways to influence, and again, like we talked about, directing force and influencing tissue through force. Different ways of doing that from a manual standpoint. Outside of that, like I said, I've always had a lot of intrigue in just strength conditioning itself. So, taking different courses within, understanding movement patterns within lifting, understanding, biomechanics of movement. Obviously, I've been a little bit biased over the last decade for baseball. So there's been a little bit more focus on understanding movement analysis within baseball. But also just understanding, I would say, just, parameters around exercise prescription has been something I've always been curious about. And I've been very fortunate to learn from a lot of very smart strength coaches that I've worked with, within the Pirates. A lot of my education outside of, going externally has just been talking shop and learning from the strength coaches I've worked with. I wouldn't be the clinician I am today if I wouldn't have had the experience working with those strength coaches over time, because it really taught me a lot about understanding parameters of exercise based off the type of qualities that you're trying to impact in the athlete or in the client. So, a roundabout way of saying, I've attempted to get a lot of exposure to a lot of different areas to, impact, the people that I work with. And also, there eventually got to a point from a education standpoint of learning a little bit more about leadership and learning how to scale ideas and develop principles and build systems, because for a while that was my role. And I wanted to continue to find ways to learn and be better at that so I could lead my group in the most effective way as I could.
Sweet. Okay, just side note, out of curiosity, you mentioned dry needling. Did you take Sue Falzoni's dry needling courses, or was it somewhere else?
I have not. No, I did
Okay.
most of my certifications through integrative dry needling, IDN. So I do know Sue's program, though. I've had some conversations with Sue, but I haven't taken her courses.
Just curious. Okay, let's let's move to today.
Okay,
You are no longer in your home state of Florida. You and
correct.
the family have packed up and you're in Colorado. And
We
yet,
are. Yeah.
and you're not in Pittsburgh, you're not in Florida, but you're still with the Pirates. Now, you're in a really unique situation. I'm sure you have nothing but gratitude toward it, but give us an idea of you going from director of sports performance. Now, what is your title? What's involved? Your roles and responsibilities?
Sure. So yeah, shifted out of that position of director of performance at the end of 2024. Primarily due to the life changes, things outside of baseball that kind of led to that, and moved into a special assistant role for performance and acquisition with the Pirates. So fortunately, I had the opportunity to continue to stay on with the Pirates, which has been a great opportunity. And I think what kind of led to the ability to kind of shift into that role was in 2021. We as a performance group were asked to have um, find a way to see if we could have an impact on the amateur scouting process of understanding athletic movement and body projections, basically. With on the scouting side, with these, at least within baseball, the scouts do their evaluations and they kind of give a general athleticism grade for each athlete. Baseball uses a 20/80 scale and they kind of give their number grade with some context behind it. But the ask was, can we go a little bit deeper on understanding the athlete on the field? So me and a few others within the department kind of worked together to build more of a system in evaluating, the idea of athleticism within the scouting process. So that has evolved over the last 3 or 4 years and got to a point where, even with this shift now, it's something that can be done primarily remotely because it's a lot of video analysis of the athletes on the field, looking at objective measures of force plate data, range of motion, some of the scouting reports that are done, and kind of taking all of that information and trying to distill out the idea of components of athleticism. And that is, I would say one primary bucket of my role in as a special assistant is, we've gotten to a pretty good place over the last 4 years or so of building this out on the amateur scouting process. And I continue to do the majority of the analysis on the amateur. That's more like domestically athletes, leading into the draft, that you have every year. But now we're also looking to develop that in pro evaluation and international scouting as well. So that's kind of the newest front with that, is build a similar framework for those two areas of scouting, although there's different challenges and constraints within each area, but trying to take the same principles of what we built on the amateur side and apply that to international and pro evaluation. So that's one bucket of the role. The other bucket is still staying involved within the sports performance realm, working as an advisor for strength conditioning and for rehab, having conversations with our staff that we have there, whether it's discussing complex cases of rehab or strength conditioning, working on integrating skill development into the strength conditioning program, discussions around changes in programming philosophy or large scale adjustments we're looking to do, staffing, all those things. So I still work as an advisor to help our leadership within performance kind of guide in the right direction in regards to continuing to develop our ability to impact players on the field from a performance standpoint. So I would say the special assistant role kind of fits into those two buckets. That's probably where I live the most when it comes to continuing to find ways to impact the organization.
Right on. And there is still some traveling that is necessary, I'm
Sure,
sure.
there's still
But
travel, and which I don't mind. Is it's a lot less than what I was doing before.
mhm.
But yeah, there's still travel where I go to the facilities and go to Pittsburgh and jump into meetings, especially on the scouting side when they're evaluating and going over players. So yeah, sure, and I don't mind that. I mean, there's definitely some travel involved there, but it does free me up. I'm able to do that, but I'm also able to start working with some athletes more locally and patients locally, more from a pure treatment and programming standpoint, that may need some help as well. So it provides a little bit of freedom there, but it's a fun game of balancing the two to make sure they're both being impacted the right way.
Now, you used a term that I'm not familiar with, and maybe you explained it, and maybe I just didn't make the connection. But you said body projection. What do you mean by that?
So at least the way that we look at it collectively is looking at it's the idea of trying to determine what an athlete's frame size, if you will look like as they mature into an adult, let's say around the age 25, 26.
Oh,
Yeah.
got
So
it.
if we're evaluating a young, 18, 19-year-old athlete, taking some measurements, skeletal measurements and using different equations and algorithms that's been built through research to get a projection or an idea of, what would this body potentially look like? What are the range of outcomes that this body may look like once they get to a certain age? That things kind of start to flatline and level out. And then how does that change in size potentially influence their ability to develop physical qualities, develop lean mass, develop expressions of force, and start to tie all those things in together back to the ultimate goal of trying to project skill development and where this athlete may be in a few years.
And of course, you look at injury history, but how does that play into the consideration of evaluation?
The injury history piece.
Yeah, just from one player to the next.
Sure, it's a large factor of it. Like it's easy as a clinician to always have the bias that we can help everybody, right? And we want to help everybody, but we also know that certain injuries, run a little bit heavier risk of re-injury, or you may see a slower return to performance with certain types of injuries. So I would say it probably weighs in more of that. It's how much chips are you betting on the fact of them either being able to return back to prior level or performance or continue to progress, or chances of re-injury, depending on certain types of injuries, and how could that influence their projectability on continuing to develop, not only physically but as from a skill development standpoint. It could slow things down, right? Like if certain injuries
Yeah.
really impact the ability to stay on the field, it's really challenging to continue to get better if you can not be on the field. The best ability is availability in a way. So you have to be not only available to play, but you have to be available to continue your own development, with the coaches. So
All right. I have a feeling you're like many of the other physical therapists that I talk to, and when I ask this question, they always have something to say with it, and that is, what's your what's your favorite injury? What's the injury that you go, oh, it's just like you start rubbing your hands together, your eyes get bigger, like we're gonna have some fun with this. Do you have one?
yeah, that's a good one. That's a good question. It's a common question, and I think it's a loaded question, right? Because I don't really think there's a lot that I don't enjoy working with, because I think all injuries are kind of a puzzle. I would say that I think through my career I've always been leaned on as being more of a shoulder specialist. I've done a lot with shoulder injuries, and obviously the settings that I've worked in, there's been a lot of practice. Unfortunately, there's a lot of
Heck
shoulder
yeah.
injuries, but I also think shoulder injuries are very unique, and they're typically always complex. There's very rarely a straightforward shoulder injury, and they're very debilitating for a lot of people, not just for athletes, but for people outside, of athleticism and the impact on daily life. Shoulder injuries can be really, really nagging and can turn into chronic issues really quickly. So I think shoulders are fun to work with because they are so complex, and there's so many other areas of the body that could be influencing how the shoulder works. And there's so much need for coordination and sequencing and muscle contraction for the shoulder to actually work the right way, right? It's not so straightforward as like a bone injury, which is like, all right, well, let's just let the bone heal. There's a lot of muscles that have to work together in unison for the shoulder to work correctly. So there's a lot of variety in the way that you could approach a shoulder injury. So I think I perk up a little bit with those, because I know there's not only is it going to be potentially a challenge, but there's a lot of different directions that would potentially could go to get the person in the place they want to be, and to get them back to performance.
Right on. Okay. And how does that relate to your past injuries yourself? You had mentioned in college you were rife with them. What are we
Yeah.
talking?
Oh yeah. I mean, maybe there is a bias there, right? Because what ended my playing career was a shoulder labral repair and rotator cuff repair. So
Not surprised.
I can empathize and sympathize with those who go through that are on my table. Also had some low back injuries. I fractured my L5 vertebrae, so that didn't play well. But interesting enough, looking back on it, I didn't know any different at the time. But looking back on it now, I'm pretty sure not really fully returning from that injury of my low back possibly led to more of my shoulder issues. And it's something that I understand now, but had no clue at the time. So it's funny how all those things can be potentially related.
So amazing. Not to get too metaphysical, but where does the shoulder begin and where does it end if we're an
Right.
integrative unit, right? So for me, it's the big toe to the little finger, and
Right.
somewhere in it's an entire shoulder that makes up that movement. But dude, this has been remarkable. I am so stoked to have this conversation with you, and of course, the time's flying by here.
Right.
Uh, just like one last question, if you don't mind, before,
Sure.
and I'll put like your LinkedIn connections in the description and all that, so the listeners can kind of follow you and so on. But um, the I won't say the best and the worst, but like, what is the best part? Obviously, your family is like one of the best parts of your life, but the best part of your occupation, your position, what would you say is the thing that gets you up in the morning, that just gets you going?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, no matter the setting, I think, when it really boils down to purpose, right? And I think that's where real satisfaction comes from, is when you have a good feel for your purpose and your influence. And for me, it's having a conversation or doing something with somebody I'm working with that helps them move the dot to be a better version of themselves. And, whether that's from doing something on the table as a clinician, working with somebody within their, strength conditioning program, helping another staff member move forward as just overall professional. Like, what really moves me forward is being able to help others and see the potential influence that I could have on making somebody else either, a better clinician, a better professional, a better teammate. That's really what drives me with learning. I'm always a very curious person. I love to learn. I love to learn new things. I love to get different perspectives from different people. But it's less about me learning to learn. It's more about, developing more ammo that I could potentially give somebody else, and just watching them grow and develop is really what it comes from. Early on as a clinician, the best thing was watching somebody get healthy and feel like they could return back to what they were doing. And, as I came more in a leadership position, it was watching my staff develop and watching them impact people, and watching them grow as a clinician and a professional. So I think that really is what drives me. And it can happen from a lot of variety of ways, but just the ability to help somebody move the dot forward and becoming the better version of themselves that they're seeking is really what drives me every day.
Awesome. I don't think there's any better calling to be a service to others. AJ, man, I can't thank you enough. This has
Yeah,
been
this has been great.
It really has, and I appreciate your time, and I look forward to. There's going to be a time where our paths cross in person, whether it's on the
For
ski
sure.
slopes of Colorado or at training camp or whatever. But I look forward to it for sure.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. This has been great.
And that's a wrap for this episode of the Zelos Podcast. I want to thank the Pittsburgh Pirates organization, as well as, of course, AJ for coming on and having a great conversation. Remember, you can always go to my website for podcast archives and my weekly blogs and continuing education, rockysnyder.com. But be sure to sign up for the course that I'm doing at the end of September, a one-day workshop all about recalibrating movement from the ground up at the Perform Better headquarters in West Warwick, Rhode Island. There are still a few spots left, so make sure you either go to performbetter.com or through my website. You can get to it either way, and join me there because it's a game changer. And until next week, you have a good one.